have simultaneous interpretation for English, Spanish, and Portuguese. The moderator is going to be Roberto Martínez, research investigator for Transparencia Internacional. Mr. Martínez, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And thank you very much to the organizers for having us all today. We have a very interesting panel today on corruption measurement. What are the new challenges? Well, what are the challenges and what is coming up? I think today's panel is very relevant, particularly in the context that we live in today. We have been seeing what the importance of statistics, of good statistics and good measurement is in the middle of this pandemic, and how important it is as well to have trustworthy data to monitor and follow up on different topics. And corruption is, of course, one of them. I think that often the discussion around corruption measurement, I think what most people think about when they hear of this is perhaps Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Indicators, but there is also much more that is being done. And today's panel is just a very colorful around the world, like trip, so to speak, of many other things that are being done in this regard. So we have 7 panelists today. I will be introducing each one of them as we go ahead. Each one of them will have 10 minutes to speak. And first we go to Bucharest, to Professor Alina Mungiu-Pippidi. She is a professor in democracy studies at the Hertie School in Berlin and director of the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building. She has authored a number of books on corruption, including A Quest for Good Governance, How Societies Build Control of Corruption, Europe's Burden, and Promoting Good Governance Across Borders. Professor Pippidi has consulted for the World Bank, UNDP, the International Monetary Fund, the European Parliament, the Swedish government, and many others. Her research projects have also resulted in many measurement tools that are publicly available online. You can check the Integrity Index, for example, at integrityindex.org, the European Public Accountability Mechanisms for the EU, opentender.eu, measurements on public procurement. And she is also the president of the Romanian Academic Society and founder of the online watchdog platform Clean Romania, or Romania Curată. So Alina, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Although you really blew my cover, I don't think anybody knows that I managed to fly from Berlin to Bucharest in the last days, in these days with many obstacles existing in the way of travel. Thank all my colleagues for accepting to join me today in this panel, UNODC for putting this together, and of course, Roberto for taking the really difficult task of pressing all this interesting information in such a short amount of time. This being said, let's start by asking, in fact, what Roberto already done, which is why do we need to reform the agenda of corruption measurement? Why are not the measurements that we already have enough? And I think the answer is quite obvious for all of us, is that despite the fact that we have been at anti-corruption for now 2 decades and a little bit more, and that we have 180 countries ratifying various treaties and engaging in one form or another of anti-corruption, we really do not know very well where we are. And we would really be hard pressed to say if the world is progressing, stagnating, or regressing. And then we would have to resort to asking people, and people are generally rather pessimistic when governance comes. So we need something a little bit more objective in order to understand if change happens, what the trends are, and what are the impacts of the anti-corruption reform and broader good governance reforms which have been going on. And that is really a very big puzzle from a variety of reasons. So we really depend on new ideas, science, innovation, and in particular, the really hard effort to collect data in this area, in simply needing to figure out if our reforms have an effect or not. So first, stating from this onset, we are interested in this panel and in general to measure corruption for the purpose of action, right? We need to understand if countries change and where reforms are going. Second, we also need to precise very clearly what exactly do we measure. And here my recommendation is that we accommodate a variety of measurements. We are not here to come up with the single corruption measurement who's going to take the Nobel Prize for corruption, which they have not yet invented, although, you know, I think that there might be some corruption in quite a lot of Nobel Prizes. But really, we are here in order to measure a variety of things, whatever constitutes a policy problem that humans want to change. And therefore, corruption is everything that we define it to be, and measurements simply should have to suit that definition very well, to be sound. So we are really interested in diversity, as long as there are contributions to tracing the evolution of a problem related to corruption in time. Now, therefore, you know, how do we do this? I mean, of course, we have some general concepts of corruption, but we really welcome all kind of proxies and measurements that people can come up with to the extent that they are able to find data. Now, why don't we succeed in meeting these aims with the measurements that we have so far? Well, the simple answer, without going in details, is that what you see here is, for instance, the control of corruption from the World Bank, which is a good measurement. I use it a lot. Uses everybody else's measurement into one aggregate. But what you see here is a blue line, which is their score, and two margins of error, which basically measure the distance between expert opinions. What do they think if the country is really changing or not? And unfortunately, most change on this planet tends to fall from one year to another, tends to fall within those two orange lines that we see. So in other words, change in governance seems to be quite small in general, except some revolutionary situations. And then it becomes a little bit uncertain, right? Because it falls within this confidence error. And this is why aggregates like control of corruption or corruption perception index are not optimal to trace change, let alone that being so general and including everyone else, they are so comprehensive that we do not know exactly to what part of corruption they refer. And therefore, they're a bit too general, right, to guide change and reforms by that. Of course, there is always the solution of asking people, and this is a good solution. You know, I'm a passionate reader of corruption surveys, but in the same time, you know, we do not have enough money, even if people would genuinely tell us what goes on. And today we really have a lot of means of asking people. We have anonymous applications on phones and other things. So I think that in the future, we're going to ask people more, not less. Right? But nevertheless, until governments create an application to evaluate every public service with one smartphone and include a part on corruption there, so that everybody safely and anonymously can use their smartphone to say if their interaction with the public sector was corrupt or not, until they do this, we really do not have enough money to measure. And that means that we have to do this general survey. So instead of going to the group of people with relevant information, you know, say drug users, because what we want to ask is a question about dealers, we have to ask everybody. And that means that we have a very great degree of imprecision because very few people have the exact specific experience that we aim to find. Now, in many, many countries, nevertheless, convictions of corruption exist. So the next question, of course, is why don't we use judicial statistics on corruption? And the answer is yes, we do. And today I invited in this panel something which is based on enforcement of corruption and which I think is the only one which would work comparatively. You're going to see and form an opinion, but the short answer is that we cannot, because this is an ambiguous indicator which measures not only corruption, but in the same time it measures enforcement, and there's no way of distinguishing which is which, right? So we do not know if Brazil sentences more politicians because political corruption is higher in Brazil than Argentina, or in fact it's the other way around. So we need to do more than that. Now, what are our innovations? Very briefly, a slide by each. So first, we created innovation number one is our index of public integrity, which is basically measuring these enablers of public integrity. So in other words, it looks at 6 very clearly definite areas, and until those areas reach a certain level, a country cannot simply meet control of corruption. Again, this is based on comparative work, and it's based on a model, which is the classic crime novel. If you are crime experts, you've heard of this before, which roughly says that it's a matter of corruption is a matter of opportunity. And poor societies have various opportunities, a lot of opportunities for corruption. So you have to balance these opportunities with the constraints that a society can put. And what we have done in this index is that by just doing a lot of statistics, we came up with the most efficient proxies for opportunities and statistics, and a country can automatically compare itself against its peers, against its income peers, and against the continent, which creates a reform agenda, a simple reform agenda. A second innovation, which exists so far only for 35 European countries, and if I understand correctly from our moderator, also from some Caribbean countries in the Transparency International project, is to look at public accountability arrangements. Again, public accountability arrangements may or not may be conducive to a good control of corruption, because a good control of corruption results from my previous slide, from this general equilibrium where judiciary matters, freedom of the press matters, quality of legislation matters, transparency matters, while public accountability tools, how you organize actually your party funding, how you organize your procurement, these are narrower things. Nevertheless, in order to know what exists out there, and simply in order to research, to see if best outcomes are correlated with the best tools, you have to document them. And we created an instrument where they are automatically quantified. So the more comprehensive the legislation on conflict of interest, for instance, the more you would get a score on this. And again, you can compare with other countries. I'm just showing it here, the European example of Malta, because it's really striking to see that Malta, which is an impressive backsliding case, has been indeed doing very badly on party funding, very badly on public procurement. So you could see that, in fact, something is rotten in this very nice place. Innovation number 3.
Now you have 2 minutes left, so please start wrapping up.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Innovation number 3, of which, in fact, several of my students work, most notably Mihaly Fazekas, but many others, and which is now institutionalized, and we would like to see it institutionalized by all governments. It's institutionalized by the European Commission in this public procurement scoreboard, which exists on the Commission website. And what you see here, it's just the single bidding indicator, which is a good indicator of government favoritism. And this exists for EU member states. And what you see here is that we calculated, since now data exists, for Albania, and we were able to compare Albania, which is an EU accession country and a poor country, Europe's poorest, against all EU members. So even like this, even with hard objective data, you are able to make comparisons. And the more you collect data, the more comparisons you make. Finally, our fourth innovation is transparency. Transparency is, as we all know, vital, only that there are doubts these days if it really works. And of course, transparency works on both sides of this balance, both reduces opportunities and enables constraints. And we were able to put together some measure of transparency. Simply by looking at websites of 120 countries, we monitored 14 websites asking what are the most important things which should be transparent for people to be able to fight corruption, right? So it's a measurement of e-transparency, of government transparency, of downward transparency, if you want. And it works, because you see here it correlates 72% of public integrity. So in fact, we do seem to have, and it's purely actionable, because you see here what's in it. It's what countries publish. What's it in the green is where countries really do well. So most people publish their legislation, for instance, online in full, or their annual budget. And what countries do really badly. Few countries have a digital land cadastre where you can find all the land to prevent land corruption. And even fewer countries, for instance, have online disclosures of interest for officials. Now you can find here all the references that we developed. And I'm really looking forward to hear what my colleagues are going to bring and enrich this universe of innovations. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alina. Next, we are posting all of the bios for the speakers also in the chat for you to read them, so that I have a bit more time to, or I can give a little bit more time to the participants. Next, we have Mr. Adrián Franco. Adrián Franco has been Vice President of INEGI, Government Board, in charge of the National Subsystem of Information on Government, Public Security, and Administration of Justice since January 2019. He holds a master's degree in management and public policy from the University of Manchester in England, and a master's degree in public policy, in public administration from my very own alma mater as well, the Center for Economic Research and Education, CIDE, in Mexico, and a bachelor's degree in political science and public administration from the National University of Mexico. So now I believe he's joining us from Mexico City. So over to you, Adrián. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I hope you are well, and hope everyone is listening me. I don't know. Thank you very much. First of all, let me express some salutations to everyone who is following this conference in other countries. Hope you, your families, and your colleagues are very well. Also for my mates here in the panel. Then I'm going to switch to Spanish in order to make a presentation, but anyway, I can reply it in English or Spanish, is the same. Buenos días a todas y a todos. Me da mucho gusto que
Good morning to all of you. I'm so glad to be here with you in this 5th International Conference on Governance, Crime, and Justice Statistics. In this session, a new agenda for corruption measuring, I was wondering about what I could address in this agenda in order to move forward with measuring corruption. The first thing that I thought was, as Alina already mentioned, and I concur with her, is measuring corruption in generic or abstract terms is not going to change anything. Multilateral, regional, international organisms and our own governments are demanding change things regarding corruption. However, if we still focus on indicators, corruption indexes are not going to be useful. What is the point of having a rank of 8 where 0 is positive, 10 is negative? That doesn't say anything because it's not explaining about anything. So we need to have specific measurements for corruption. If I enter corruption in Dr. Google, I am going to have more than 280 million hits, thousands of definitions, papers, documents, indexes, and recipes to fight against that. A host of things that can give me more context regarding corruption. And we rather go to Dr. Google instead of going to the doctor when we are sick. So we know everything about definitions. What is corruption? Or what seems to be corruption, but at the end of the day, what is corruption that affects the vast majority of populations? And that is not included in general definitions. This is a transaction, an exchange between two people. One of them can have a higher position and can ask for that transaction. It can facilitate that transaction, and it is out of the legal framework. They generate private and individual profits that are not collective. And usually, society don't want this type of transactions. Public policy designers should be challenged. What is in the intermediate part of corruption? What are they interchanging? Who are doing that? Where are doing that? We can put all this information in a map, and then we can have what do we need to change? What are the processes that have to be modified to minimize the corruption problem? And if we know the how, and here we can include the context of different international measurements like measuring accountability, transparency, balance of power. They are just contextual things that promote corruption risk. So when we go to school, when we have to pay taxes, when we have a lot of international transactions between private and public sectors, then we can have an opportunity for corruption. Corruption is a social problem. Is it considered a social problem? In the case of Mexico, and I am going to base my comment in the INEGI statistics. 9 out of 10 people consider that in their entity, corruption is a host of frequent transactions. And then we can disaggregate this by entity. But is it a problem? For the general population over than 18 years old, half of them consider that corruption is a problem because they are affected by that. However, it is not a problem that is perceived generally like that, because for economic units, for entrepreneurs, corruption is not a problem. For them, the problem are taxes, low flow of cash for their business, or natural disasters. Why businesses think that corruption is not a problem? Well, because if there were no corruptions, they couldn't have their businesses, because corruption streamlines their processes. So it's a win-win situation for a lot of business economics and for these business units and for these businesses. 1 out of 10 people consider that their colleagues, their neighbors are part of these corrupted transactions. 1 out of 10 consider that policemen, political parties are corrupted. The idea of having accurate corruption measures is very good because it's part of the 16 SDGs. Well, SDGs 16.5.1 talks about transactions, people that are in touch with public servants, but we can have transactions between companies, between corporations, or people between corporations. However, this is related to public sector, people that have interaction with public servants that pay for some actions. So if governments, international organizations focusing on producing the information for these two SDGs and their subsequent information, we could be moving forward on fighting against corruption with public policies. In Mexico, how the corruption change starts, people has 400 million transactions with public servants. We are talking about people that approaches agencies to have something done. And we have concentrations, Mexico City, in the state of Mexico, 26 million people, and 100 million processes are focusing on this area that they have risk to be corrupted because 48% of these transactions have a problem. So we have a problem when we want to process a service. And these are risks for corruption because the person in power that has to provide the service can ask for a corruption. And the economic people is 25%. We notice that 9 out of 10 people know that in their state, corruption is very frequent. Over here, you see the way we have corruption rates. 62% thinks that there were corruption in the processes and services that they receive. 44% knows about someone that is corrupted. And 15% or 16% of people know that they were victim of an act of corruption. What does this mean? That out of 36 million of people that were in touch with public servants, 5.8 million people were corrupted. We know in which specific services were having corruption. So we see all this information disaggregated. 1 out of 4 when they were requesting a permit for construction or something like that. So 6 million people and companies were experiencing corruption acts. So there is an estimate of 719 million US cost directs of corruption. 2.4 million people were victims of corruption acts by being in touch with public offenders in the second semester of 2020, even with the pandemic. The pandemic didn't stop corruption acts, at least when they were in touch with policemen. Where this is happening? In the cities. We do know where the concentrations happen. We know where corruption can occur. Now, regarding the security and justice process, we know that victims are victims of corruption when they approach public or law enforcement agencies when they want to make a report because they were victim of a crime. So prevalence of corruption affects trust. There is a 33% of mistrust. And what is the most serious problem? The most serious problem is that we have serious problems and we have great measurements. However, the main challenge is that out of the 32 states, only half of them have an anti-corruption problem. We have more than 2,000 independent local governments, and only 0.05 of them have anti-corruption plans. And if we scan all this information, we know that they have assets declaration of public servants and final thoughts. First, we need to increase the supply of data and statistics of specific corruption. No large abstractions, but specific information. We have to move forward on the petite and the grand corruption, the petite corruption that I presented recently, that are bribes and other type of corruption as well. And secondly, we need to think that we need to link this information with specific policies and policy makers. We need to have a user's definition, and then we have to help users to understand and to use all the information that we have regarding corruption. So,
muchas gracias, Adrián. Thank you very much, everyone. All right. So next, we have a joint presentation with Dr. Laarni Escresa. She is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. She earned her PhD in law and economics at the University of Bologna and Erasmus University Rotterdam, and her master's in law and economics at the University of Hamburg and Ghent University. She's also joined by Lucio Picci. He is a political scientist from the University of Bologna, where he is also professor of economics and holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at San Diego. His main research interest, and what they will be presenting about today as well, is at the intersection between political economy, public governance, and the economics of innovation. He has also published widely on these issues. Like I said earlier, more information on their bios can be found now in the chat. Laarni, I believe you're starting now, so please go ahead. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So hello, good morning, everyone. And first, we're going to present a measure of cross-national corruption that we developed, which is called the Public Administration Corruption Index, or PACI. So how is this different from other cross-national measures of corruption? First, unlike perception-based measures, this index of corruption has the advantage of being based on objective data. It is based on actual reported cases of cross-border bribery. The collection of cases was made possible with the ratification of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which made it illegal to bribe a foreign public official and made it prosecutable and enforceable domestically in the firms of the headquarters country. So our Picci index is, we think, the only viable alternative to perception-based measures. So the intuition behind the index is this. So for each reported case, we recorded the origin of the bribe, the firm headquarters country, let's say the US, and the destination of the bribe, the country of the public official, let's say country X. So we don't consider how many cases there are involving, say, US firms to indicate how much corruption there is in the USA. This would be erroneous because, as like what Alina mentioned, this may be this would be erroneous since the US may be discovering more corrupt cases simply because of the good quality of its judiciary and institutions, and not necessarily because there is a lot of corruption there. We consider instead the geographic distribution of those cases, the geographical distribution of the destination of the bribes as the correct indicator of corruption. Suppose, for example, that half of the bribes abroad by US firms were disbursed to public officials in country X. However, country X represents only 10% of the interaction of the US with the rest of the world. So because of this, we could conclude that country X has a higher level of corruption. And the Picci index, the Picci, considers cases where firms are not only in the US, but the index considers all firms headquartered elsewhere in the world and aggregates them appropriately and accordingly. So this graph shows the comparison of the Picci, which is based on objective measure, with the World Bank Control of Corruption Index, which is a subjective measures. And as you can see, there is a relative high correlation between the two, right? Note that the scale is reversed, right? So in the vertical axis, you see the Picci, higher levels of Picci indicate higher levels of corruption, while the reverse is true for the World Bank Control of Corruption Index. So given that the correlation is high, one is objective, one is based on subjective measures, perceptions, the next question is, does this apparently vindicate the subjective measures of corruption, which had been widely criticized in the literature? And to discuss more about that would be my colleague Lucio.
All right. Well, thank you. Can I start? Sorry, Roberto. Yes. You are the boss here, so.
Please do go ahead. You have 7 minutes left, so go for it.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Laarni. Thank you all. I see that there are more than 400 people. Thank you to the organizers. Well, the last slides that Laarni showed seems to vindicate the Transparency International, for example, Corruption Perception Index, or other measures that are based on the perceptions of the levels of corruption, such as the one that also well known by the World Bank, which is, by the way, very similar in results, in terms of results, to the Transparency International Corruption Index. But Laarni, you have the slides. Can you go to the previous slide, please? Okay, thank you. Anyway, so, after 20 years, I remember my last time in Mexico was 18 years ago. It was December 2003 in Merida, and the occasion was the signature of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And there were a series of events. One of them, one of measuring corruption, and they had been invited actually by Transparency International. And the idea there, the punchline was, we are not happy about perception-based indicators. We want to do more. So that was close to 20 years ago in Mexico. So, underlining the role of Mexico in the debate on corruption. And here we are again. So in a way, are we really vindicating the perception-based measures or not, given that the key characteristic of our measure is that it's not based on perceptions, nothing to do with that. It's totally different the way that it pulls out a measure of corruption. Well, in fact, unfortunately, not so. And I just highlight two issues. The first one, if you can see the slide, is levels versus time variations. So the levels, yes, Professor Escresa just showed that with that graph. more or less the same story with a correlation which is above 0.8, very high, pretty much the same message. But if we try to use our measure, and here we go back to what Alina was showing before, to get an idea of changes in time, we have to do a series of compromises, because one of the shortcomings of our measures is that we cannot produce it for every year. So we do it for 5-year periods, and we also do it for groups of countries. But there we get a message which is completely different. Our measured changes of corruption in time are different from the ones that we obtain using perception-based indicators. Is that a big contradiction with what we said before? I mean, the levels are more or less the same, changes in time are not. Again, the graph that Alina was showing, I think, is instructive. The point is that we have much more variations cross-country between different countries, and barring exceptions, you know, success stories or serious backsliding, corruption tends to be relatively constant in time. I don't know if luckily or unluckily, depending on where you start from, and also perception-based measures have serious issues to measure changes in time. The other question, and really the last point that I would like to make, and I kindly ask if we can go to the next slide. One measure, one issue, one way to think of corruption is levels of corruption. Another point of view on corruption is try to get a measure of the supply side of corruption. It is a propensity of big firms to bribe abroad. And here, an interesting result, which I think is underappreciated, we had a measure by Transparency International, which was called the Bribe Payers Index, and that it's kind of mysteriously disappeared from the website. Well, if we look at that, we compare it with the measures of the same propensity to bribe abroad, which comes from a different use of our same data. So it's the same approach of the Picci that Dr. Escresa illustrated. We get completely different results. And please have a quick look at the very last graph and the point that I would like to make. Well, here you see that the two graphs are reversed, the scales are reversed, because our index gives higher values to more corruption, whereas both the TI-CPI, the Transparency International corruption, both indices of Transparency International give higher values to lower levels of perceived corruption. And here we get, you see a different measure. For example, if you look here, the country, say Mexico, right? Mexico seems to be highly corrupt in terms of the propensity of Mexican firms to bribe abroad. We find the opposite. And we argue, and I think we demonstrate, the Transparency International index is seriously flawed. I mean, there was serious mistakes in doing that. And the sad story is that it's really still used in a way, because it was never officially recognized by Transparency International that there was these serious mistakes. I mean, they privately recognized that, but they never acknowledged that. So, I mean, the two indexes together for Transparency International, they were proposing a sort of corruption as a national sin narrative. Whereas, you know, countries that are more corrupt, their firms are also more prone to corrupt abroad. In fact, we find that the country where you see at the top of our ranking is Switzerland. You know, Switzerland is a very clean country, but it has a lot of multinational firms. So in fact, another important distinction, which I think we have to make, and I think is not appreciated enough, is between levels of corruption versus the propensity of corrupt. I see among the more than 400 guests that we have at least one from Tanzania. So we don't even have a single case of Tanzanian firms, and with this note I terminate, bribing abroad. Is that because Tanzanian entrepreneurs are more honest? Maybe, but we also have to recognize that there are not many firms in Tanzania, which is a developing country, that can contest markets abroad. So the two concepts sometimes are really mixed together, and I think we should be clear about distinguishing levels within propensities to corrupt. The two things may be very different. Next
Lucio,
slide.
you got 1 minute left.
I'm done. You know, just the next slide.
All
is,
right.
You know, the whole point that we make is that by leveraging the geographic distribution of cases, we can learn a lot. We demonstrate that, I think, with our data set, but there are other uses, and other people are doing that. You know, the Panama Papers is one example. There is an important paper, you see that cited there. They make the same point. You know, we look at where are their accounts from. That's kind of the same idea. Open data and data generated by financial intelligence units are amenable to such analysis. In Italy, the Italian Anti-Corruption Authority, with which I collaborate on a big data project, is trying to work in these directions, and other organizations around the world are trying to do the same. Again, thank you very much. Gracias.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lucio and Laarni. All right, now we're going to move to Colombia, I believe, with Dr. Mounu Prem, who works as an adjunct professor at the University of El Rosario. He holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University and an MA and BA in economics from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. So Mounu, you've got 10 minutes, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Yes, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, we
can. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for putting all this panel together. I think it's very interesting. I'm learning a lot, so I'm super happy as well to be participating in it. So what I'm going to talk about, it's a bit different to what you have been talking, and I think it's complementary in a way with you guys have been talking about. So what I'm going to talk is about measuring patronage and corruption, but now I'm thinking about the local level. So I'm not going to be trying to compare countries. I'm going to try to see whether we can learn something about the geographic distribution within the country. So for this, and as Adrián was mentioning, then to measure corruption is super hard because of its nature, because it entails some transaction between parties, and these transactions are super hard to observe. And most of the data that we know comes from surveys, as most of you already have been mentioning, comes from Transparency International and so on. But the question is, how can we create sensitive measures at the subnational level so governments can try to put some efforts on some areas in the country? Because we know that going after corruption has a lot of cost, auditing has a lot of cost. So if we know more or less where there is more chances that corruption is emerging, maybe we can order our funds in a better way, or we can manage our funds in a better way. So for this, I'm going to mention about 3 pieces of work that I've been working on in the last years. One is using administrative data, the other one audit reports, and then the other one is kind of mixing information that we know at the local level with data science tools. So in the first paper is a paper with Emanuel Colonelli and Eduardo Teso. And in this paper, we were trying to understand whether there was any preferential access to public sector jobs, and whether this preferential access kind of followed a quid pro quo relationship, where basically the party in power can reward some supporters of this party once they get into power. And for this, we use a now very commonly used dataset or type of dataset in economics, which is this employer-employee dataset that usually comes from unemployment insurance, and you can see it in many countries in Latin America as well. And the idea of this dataset is basically that you can follow workers across time, and you can know where they are working. So whether they are working in the public sector, in the private sector, and how they move across different firms or sectors. And then what we can do, given that national identifiers exist, we can merge this with, for example, campaign donors information or local political candidates, and see what happens to these people that are supporting the party that now is taking place in these municipalities. And what we find is there is a sharp increase in the probability that these supporters get a job in the public sector. And this more or less follows this idea of the quid pro quo relationship between both parties. So for example, if I'm a donor and I donated more money, it's more likely that I'm going to get a job in the public sector, and as well, the salary that I'm going to get in the public sector is going to be higher. And what we find, which is unfortunate as well, is that these people that are now coming to the public sector are coming with lower skills. Of course, these are lower measurable skills, that they are just proxies, but basically they are bringing their friends or their connected individuals to the public sector, and these individuals come with a low quality. So this is one piece of evidence where basically we can start using administrative data at the country level to try to understand who are the people who are coming to the public sector. Then in the second piece of evidence, it's a paper with Emanuel Colonelli as well. And in this one, we take advantage of randomized audits in Brazil. And the idea of these randomized audits is that they just randomly select one municipality, they go there and they try to see what was going on with the public funds in these municipalities, kind of the usual idea that we have with audits. But the good thing in Brazil is that it's randomized, so we can learn a little bit more about what these audits can do at the local level. And by using this random timing, what we find is that there is a boost in the economic activity in these municipalities after the audits. So already using these kind of tools, it can tell us a little bit about the relationship between corruption and other outcomes at the local level. It cannot be only economic activity. You can look at other things. For example, some others have seen whether this changed the way people vote whenever you show that one mayor is corrupt, or whether this is correlated with educational outcomes, or, for example, which is very related to our work as well, is that after an audit, there is a drop in corruption. And the last piece of evidence that I want to share with you is basically based on these audits. Think that now I have more or less 2,000 municipalities that were audited at least once since 2003 and 2014. So I know by reading these audits how corrupt were these municipalities. So now I have a cross-section measure of corruption at the municipality level, but I don't have it for full Brazil. So is there a way to create a corruption measure for the full Brazil? And what we try to do in this paper with Colonelli again and Jorge Gallego is to try to predict corruption using machine learning models. So think that now we assemble a super good data set of more than 150 municipality characteristics that goes from the private sector to the public sector to natural resources and so on. And we see whether these canonical machine learning models can have a bite in predicting corruption. And we find that there is a scope for predicting corruption, which is super good if you're thinking that you need to target now the audits to some places that are more corrupt, or you want to put more efforts in some municipalities that you think are more corrupt. And very related to this is a paper with Juan Vargas and Jorge Gallego, where basically we do something similar in Colombia. Think that we have now all the mayors that were prosecuted in the last 8 years, and we can try to predict in which municipalities this is more likely to happen. So in which context, think of this as creating a corruption risk municipality level index that can tell us in which place corruption is more likely to emerge. And then what we do, and try to understand what happened with the pandemic and corruption, what we do is kind of having this cross-section variation in the corruption risk at the municipality level. We now see whether there is any differential change in the way procurement is done in these municipalities after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as with the relaxation of different public procurement requirements that was done by the government because of this pandemic. And what we find is that in these municipalities that have a higher risk of corruption, there is worse public procurement outcomes. So they use more discretionary outcomes, they give the contracts to campaign donors, they are more likely, these mayors, to be prosecuted lately. So basically, what we are showing is that this type of index can also be informative whenever we want to understand how policies can affect a country, especially in the geographic dimension. So just to conclude, I think that merging administrative dataset can be one way to understand or to give us some sense of early warnings of corruption at the local level. Also using audits can inform us about the relationship between corruption and other outcomes of interest. And I think there is a big scope of the use of data science plus innovative data to try to target our efforts of audits and other monitoring policies. And I think many of the governments now are putting their efforts in creating these groups of data scientists within the administration to try to monitor corruption, which is something, for example, that they are doing here in Colombia to try to understand where corruption is more likely to emerge using these kind of tools. Thank you, Roberto.
Perfect. You're going to be my favorite student today because you're 2 minutes short. So if you ever find yourself in Berlin, I'll get you a beer for that. That applies to everyone who's like also short on time, who cuts it short. So thank you very much. Next, we're going to go to Albania, to Mr. Zef Preci. Dr. Preci is a macroeconomist with 25 years of experience in research, policy formulation, and project implementation activities. He holds a degree in economics from the Institute of Economic Studies, Academy of Science of Albania. And he held high-profile public positions such as Minister of Public Economy and Privatization, Senior Advisor to the President of the Republic of Albania, First Chair and member of the Competition Authority, Advisor to the Supreme Auditing Authority Chairman, and many more. So you can read the whole bio in the chat. Zef, over to you.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. I'm really honored to be together in this interesting, very helpful forum. In my short presentation, what I wanted to share with you, first of all, under guidance of Center for the Study of Democracy in Bulgaria, starting from year 2000, we have established a network of civil society organizations named Southeast Leadership for Development and Integrity. And from that time, we have been doing some measurements of public perception about corruption. And starting from year 2015, we have been developing some other instruments, some other tools in measuring state capture. In addition to, in our region and in my country, in Albania, in addition to these two instruments, corruption monitoring system and state capture assessment diagnostics, there is recently developed another tool, TA and Institute for Democracy and Mediation, ground corruption cases and tailor-made laws. Very interesting analysis. These are three main tools used. Of course, before that, we have been using BEEPs and other instruments under guidance of World Bank and EBRD. The tool we are using last 4 years, SCAD, State Capture Assessment Diagnostics. It's a comprehensive methodology for monitoring and exposing state capture vulnerabilities. It is an evidence gathering mechanism that policymakers need to utilize for two main purposes. First of all, to detect the existence of state capture practices in given economic sectors and regulatory enforcement agencies. Second, to suggest policy adjustments which prevent the utilization of institutions of public governance to private ends. Alina was asking before, why do we make such measurements? Indeed, I believe that public opinion is really tired with data, and things are moving so slowly. But we believe that, as a researcher, we believe that measurement of corruption and state capture could help us to shift from current situation into some good governance actions. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. This methodology, this tool, SCAD, includes two major components. Business state capture pressure, which is centered on monopolization pressure at national, sectoral, and institutional level, and state capture enables, which encompasses institutional and institutional factors at national level. Business state capture pressure at national level is measured through indicators which reflect monopolization pressure and the ineffectiveness of anti-monopoly laws. Monopolization pressure reflects the share of total company turnover of a country concentrated in economic sectors considered by experts to suffer from monopoly. The ineffectiveness of anti-monopoly laws indicator reflects the share of surveyed experts who believe that existing anti-monopoly laws across economic sectors help rather than impede the formation of monopolistic, oligopolistic, or cartel structure in the country. In regional base, if you can see the slide number 4. Next slide, please. In regional base, the SCAD data shows that Albania has the least effective anti-monopoly laws among the country under review. The second element related to this tool is state capture enablers. Next slide 6, please. The tool, the SCAD, further monitors the number of state capture enablers like characteristics of social domains which affect the system of governance by allowing or facilitating state capture. Those may be institutional or environmental. And there is a graph explaining it. SCAD tools reveals the presence of strong environmental enablers such as ineffectiveness of public organizations which lack integrity, impartiality, and robust anti-corruption rules. It also shows symptoms of business state capture pressure, example, monopolization happening at national, sector, or institutional level. The energy is among the risk sectors due to its high level of concentration, inefficient corporate governance structures of state-owned enterprises, and lack of adequate oversight. On slide number 8, next slide, please. Next one. All factors I mentioned are exposed here, and this has been used for us to analyze different sectors, recently the energy sector. Coming back to what Alina asked before, and when I was listening presentation of Adrián, I was thinking he's speaking for my country, not for his country, because the problems are quite similar. But there is a big question mark. The largest rhetoric about corruption, at least in my country and in West Balkan countries, is coming from government. How to wake up, how to incite, how to put under operation the political will. This is why civil society and our organizations are trying to push on that direction. In the same time, I would like to come back to a study we did on year 2000, being commissioned by OSI, Open Society Institute in Budapest, about anti-corruption projects and corruption perception versus corruption perception. And the main conclusion of that time was anti-corruption projects until that time, until year 2000, were increased, but corruption perception and corruption itself was increased much faster. I'm afraid that the situation is still the same, despite our efforts, measurements, etc. What could be done in the future? I have just one more slide. What could be done in the future? We believe that continuing, pushing ahead with improving independence bodies, continuing with justice reform, can move forward toward end of impunity culture, because impunity culture is the biggest disease we have in whole functioning of public state agencies in our region. Meanwhile, EU is a real attractive flag for majority part of citizens. Fortunately, still, but I believe that we need to use it, and the EU itself to use this important force, driving force, to enhance reforms and to put some more conditionalities to individual countries in order to move in that direction. Meanwhile, we believe that using these tools like state capture, assessment diagnostics, or monitoring corruption policy implementation, MACP, we are using indeed, to come up with some results and to encourage reforms on sectors with high monopolization pressure could help. I believe that after 30 years of so-called transition, which is not anymore transition, in countries like Albania, it's very important to move from anti-corruption and corruption, etc., to good governance, from rhetoric to real actions, and make the country more livable, because people lost hopes, and for that reason, if we do not, if the improvement, if the functioning of entire governmental machinery, starting with elections, will not get improved, situation could be deteriorated and worsened. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zef. You also did it under the allocated time, so you also get a beer next time you're in Berlin. Now we're moving to our last panelist, Alexandrahaberson. She is a senior governance specialist in the governance global practice of the World Bank, where she leads research and global policy engagement activities on anti-corruption, including most recently on the use of data analytics to advance the analysis of corruption and the effectiveness of anti-corruption policies. She is an expert on a range of anti-corruption policy areas, such as asset declaration systems, conflict of interest prevention, regulations, beneficial ownership transparency, whistleblower protections, and many, many more. Before we go to you, Alexandra, I would like to remind all of the attendees that you can post questions in the chat box. Well, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and they will be sent to me. So if you have any questions, please start sending them to me. Now, Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I will try also to earn that beer in Berlin as far as possible. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this really interesting session. I want to second Alina's introductory remarks that these kinds of actionable approaches that we've seen today are really needed to supplement existing indices and survey-based methods. What I'd like to do very briefly is to share with you a research program at the World Bank, which is complementary to these efforts. I only have a couple of slides to share, and then we'll tell you a little bit more about this effort. This is a research program. Just a moment. This is a research program that we're undertaking in collaboration with academic and development partners to advance data analytics for anti-corruption in public administration. The sort of research program encompasses a call for proposals. We've already received and reviewed all of the submissions. The successful submissions have been notified, and we're looking forward to the symposium in September. I will post a link in the chat box so you can have more information about this research program and also keep track of the invitation to participate. We have 4 research streams: data-driven approaches to detecting and measuring corruption, using new data sources and methods to measure the impacts of corruption, assessing the effectiveness of anti-corruption tools, policies, and interventions, and contributing new knowledge around data quality, privacy, and access issues in the anti-corruption field. I'd like to add, and I meant to remark on this in my first remarks, is that what we're doing here, I think, complements very well the proposals that you've seen presented today, and aligns particularly with Mounu's presentation on the use of data analytics. So we've established 5 review criteria for the selection of submissions: impact, practicality, rigor, scalability, and replicability. All of the presenters that you've heard from today, I think, have spoken about the importance of scalability and replicability. Given that data science and the use of data science working with open data is still quite experimental, I think drawing a hard line on scalability and replicability could exclude the possibility of some really innovative ideas. So what we're trying to do is to encourage that scalability with the understanding that working with a mix of open data and public sector data, that isn't always possible. So a little bit more about what we've seen so far on this research proposal. The focus on open data has been very deliberate, and that's because we wanted to go beyond data published by public authorities and explore new sources of data that may not yet have been considered in the anti-corruption realm. And we also, by focusing on open data, we're also acknowledging that we're very reliant for this particular research program on data that lends itself to data analytic methods. In other words, that it can be extracted, aggregated, matched with other kinds of data and analyzed. This means not only big data methods but also small data methods. Since we're working with public sector data, and as I mentioned, we need to be quite experimental. We're very excited by the range of proposals that we've received. Some of the areas of some of the kinds of data that these focus on include new types of data, as well as new ways of linking familiar data sources, public procurement, unsurprisingly, financial disclosures, also campaign and political financing, audit reports, for example, using data analytics to look for outliers or to do text mining in audit reports. The other important thing that we're focusing on, and Mounu's presentation focused on this as well, is the potential of using these kinds of data types and analytic methods working with subnational data sets. So we can look at corruption trends and patterns at the municipal level as well. And we're excited to see there have been a number of proposals that do that. The other thing that we've seen, which is also exciting, is the transnational dimension of corruption, and using certain kinds of available data sets as proxies or corollaries of corruption, such as shell company registration, among other things. The other thing that we've seen is proposals around new methods, working with imagery, satellite imagery as well, as a way of linking that as a possible indicator of corruption with other types of data sources. We've seen proposals that rely on machine learning, where there is data that's reliable enough to undertake those kinds of methods, anomaly detection, cataloging of open data, and also working with unstructured data. There are also some proposals looking or exploring applications of blockchain. Other important features of this initiative, I've already mentioned that we're collaborating with academic and development partners, also with the Data and Policy Journal published by Cambridge University Press. They will publish a special collection of the research that comes out of this effort. We're working with the Career Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management, with the University of Sussex Government Transparency Institute, Alan Turing Institute, and the CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, and the OCCRP. I'm going to forget the acronym, so I'm not going to try it. The other thing that we're focusing on is to bring public authorities into the symposium, so that they can share innovations that are happening in the public sector. And we've already seen examples in the panel today. And we will also be focusing on bringing in NGOs that are innovating in this space. Data science requires collaboration across disciplines. And this is why a research program that relies on crowdsourcing and bringing in lots of different partners is a really important part of this approach. We can't just do it with political scientists alone. We need to bring in data scientists, we need to bring in mathematicians, and corruption subject matter experts. The other thing that we're hoping to do that's innovative by combining new data sources and methods is that we can try to observe or infer behaviors. So this goes beyond looking at the prevalence or implementation of institutions or the active, of laws, and hopefully get at vulnerabilities that transparency alone cannot necessarily expose. So, for example, the diversion of legitimate public expenditures to favor certain groups or locations that may, on the face of it, look perfectly acceptable. The globalization of corruption and the outsized roles played by offshore jurisdictions in illicit financial flows means that national measures based on observable data will not give us the full picture of risk or progress in fighting corruption. So these kinds of approaches can help amplify the impact of transparency laws that make this data available and can then be extracted and used by people for these purposes. So the symposium, our overarching goal is to generate and advance the science around corruption measurement and analysis, and then to have that lead into actionable policy insights. So that's a big piece of the work that is yet to be done, but is very important for us not to lose sight of. One other project that I wanted to mention, and this connects also with with Alina's remarks at the beginning is we're working on we're about to launch a prototype of a global procurement and anti-corruption transparency platform. This we're doing in partnership with the Government Transparency Institute, Mihaly Fazekas, and the University of Sussex. And this is an effort to scale up the work that's already been done and that Alina mentioned at the beginning of the open tender platform, working with EU data to make this as global as possible. So we look forward to sharing more information on that as well. I'll finish there and very happy to answer questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We do have, okay, so I think we did it. Congratulations, everyone. We're on time. We have time for questions. I've been going through the chat, and I mean, I wanted to like maybe say a few words to bring this all together and also like share with the audience what we just saw. So I guess what we just saw in a way is how complex the phenomena of corruption is, because I think at every single, at all points in time, we were all talking about corruption in a way, but each one of you was also measuring different aspects of this phenomena. I mean, Adrián, for example, and Lucio and Laarni were focusing mostly on, well, bribery, foreign bribery. So a very specific and narrow type of, well, manifestation of corruption. We also had with Mounu, we saw more ways of like patronage, embezzlement, deviation of public funds, nepotism. So we saw like many other expressions of corruption itself. Zef talked about state capture. So each one of you was in a way capturing different elements of this phenomena. And I think when we try to fight corruption, I think that is precisely the challenge, right? That I think each one of these different tools will give us different recommendations. And if we follow, if we focus on curbing bribery, does not necessarily mean that we will improve on some of the other measures that we saw today. So my question to you, because it's also something that people on the chat are asking, is back to you. What would be then, in one sentence, each one of you, what are the recommendations that come from your specific tool? Let's not talk about corruption, but talk about the specific manifestation of corruption that you're studying. What are the recommendations that come from your analysis? How do we stop this manifestation of corruption? Shall we start in the same order as we started? So maybe Alina or Adrián want to say something about this?
Right, thank you. First, let me just say something that Roberto, who is our very gracious host today, cannot say, because he is a lead researcher with Transparency International, but as today he's just a moderator, he's in an awkward situation. So I would like to say clearly that corruption perception index is not something that we consider doesn't play any role or is any sort of fraud out there. Corruption perception index as it is now, it is perfectly well computed based on various expert scores. Its constitutive problems are out there and discussed in the open. And I think it would be very difficult for the kind of measurements that we speak to ever reach the power into shaming that corruption perception index has. So we are discussing here complementary measurements. Okay, we really don't want to consider either CPI or the World Bank measurements passé and we throw them. I mean, a lot of research were based on these two indexes. And I have to say this since I'm not with Transparency International and actually quite a well-known critic of them. But since nobody from Transparency is a panel, just a moderator, we need to say this. But returning to the question, so I think that what comes out of our panel, and I think the world of innovations in corruption is not as vast as our friends in World Bank or IMF and other organizations which compete these days to launch out calls. Imagine. I mean, I'm very happy if each of them will be able to uncover two good and sound measurements that can really be used for policy and can really be replicated from one country to another. What I think comes out from our panel, and what is my main recommendations, is that governments should turn into permanent monitoring some of these tools. We fought for years to convince the European Commission, for instance, to create this European single market procurement scoreboard. And it's not popular yet. So people don't really use it. You know, I showed it to you, but not many people in the European Commission like and use these instruments, although it shows very clearly where money go. You know, and the big suspects like Poland and Hungary, I mean, you look there and you see them immediately. You could have seen them from years before political problems started. So this is something that every government can do. I'm very happy that Mounu says that his government already is doing something. When I was in civil society 15 years ago, and I pioneered this cross-checking of data on political finance with returns in the form of public contracts, I knew that there must be a more economical way of doing this. You know, I employed like 80 journalists to check all the data, to check all the candidates for parliaments, their companies, and the money and public contracts that those companies received. Okay, today an algorithm exists, and Romanian National Integrity for Agency just checks automatically two databases, the public procurement portal with the words and the Register of Commerce, and all they need is a list of officials, and they just check this. And this is the prevent call system. I'm still not happy with the system because the system is not transparent. So in other words, it's not that the algorithm is up there on the website and everybody can use it. So there is a bit of selectivity. So I do not know. There are still people who might have some immunity, you know, because as long as we do not check them. But just an example that governments can use this and turn this into, we're not speaking refined measurements here. What is important in corruption is not extraordinarily refined or technically advanced, because then nobody will use it. It's simply about uncovering data, being able to use data which is out there as data, and coming up with a permanent monitoring so to deter corruption. And of course, what we can do is to invent, show how it's done, and then governments should take it up and turn into permanent monitoring system. That's my main recommendation. Do you know of a good innovation? Do you know of at least one reform-minded person in a government? This can start in an agency. It doesn't need to be the whole government. Just petition that person and ask him to give an example on how, for instance, as I said originally, you can create a consumer survey for your agency. You can be the water utility agency, and everybody with a client number in the same time has an evaluation form. And in that evaluation form, you will have 2 questions on corruption. And of course, then you can tie it into the contract of the manager of this. And if he has too many bad evaluations, you can replace the manager, because you want people to say in the evaluation, oh yes, the integrity of this agency is very high. So I think the actionability avenue is fantastic. It's wide open, okay? But it is not easy, of course, to make policymakers act. Thank you. I was long, sorry for this.
Thank you. Now, I wanted to pick up on a point that Alina raised and maybe link it to, and then send this question to Adrián, because one of the points Alina is making is, you know, maybe we don't need such refined or sophisticated measures to make a big difference. And I think what Adrián showed in his presentation is what power it has to you know, to measure bribery properly. For example, when you have like a proper survey at the national level that does not give you, at Transparency International, we also tried to do that through the Global Corruption Barometer, but of course we do not have the means or resources of a national statistics office. So I think what you were showing were precisely the different ways in which we can, you know, trace bribery, look at bribery, and then fight it. Could you please maybe tell us a little bit more about, you know, in which other ways you're using surveys to like fight corruption through the National Statistics Office?
Gracias, Roberto.
Yes, thank you so much, Roberto. When you are an expert in measuring, you know that measuring by measuring, that's not the purpose. It's going to be just an indicator, having a percentage, a rate. That's not the purpose, let alone with corruption matters. The purpose of measuring something is for this to be transformed in specific actions to solve a problem. If we still think that measuring is the purpose of this, we cannot expect for any change in corruption worldwide, locally, or domestically. At the end of the day, indicators have a purpose, but they have constraints, restrictions, errors as well. So we need to start thinking about what is the purpose for indicators. Global indicators, for my own opinion, serve for the purpose of global agenda, but are not necessarily useful to solve a problem in a country. And if we follow up these indicators expecting changes, then we are going to lose the trust at a local level. They are going to be published and they are going to be a huge news, but that's it. However, in the case of Mexico, and I am talking about my country, we have developed in the last 10 years 8 national surveys, different surveys that have to do with corruption matters. 8 different surveys, multiply them by year, by quarter, or by every 2 years that have to do with civil culture, victimization in companies, corruption in companies, corruption in individuals, citizen trust, and corruption in public services. The role of the statistics office like ours is to provide information for others to make decisions. And this is the gap that we have. We produce high quality information so someone can use it. And this is the challenge for the statistics office. We are data producers. In the next few days, we are going to build a task group to make a global measurement of corruption that hopefully will help countries understand how they can customize this global information into regional information so they can transform data in actions. The purpose in our country is that this data has to be translated into public policies. I don't fight against corruption. However, I can assist the Ministry of Anti-Corruption to design programs at a federal level. But locally, we have a challenge because we have 24,000 local governments and they don't have institutional capabilities. We know that because we monitor that aspect as well. They cannot include this in their daily activities, monitoring or assessment of corruption. And they have a problem as well as states. So our work, in order to answer your question, we are going to produce statistical data of high quality to be used by someone. So this gap needs to have a bridge. Maybe statisticians have to narrow down this gap. We have to make users and public policies designers to understand it better so they can have actionable data. And this is the great challenge that we have in our country. So I think this is the right way to discuss about corruption measuring.
I'm a big fan of like the way in which INEGI has taken the questions on bribery and perceptions of corruption as well and like mainstream them into national surveys. This year at Transparency International, we also started adding a question on the use of personal connections to get public services, which is another way in which favoritism can manifest itself. So, I think since what we measure is really what we fight, it will also be at some point important to discuss which other ways or other manifestations of corruption could be introduced into such surveys. Because I think one of the things that we saw today as well in the panel is that we can use old methods like survey methods, right, to make a big difference in our study of corruption. Another point that was standing out in this panel, and Alexandra and Mounu both touched on it, was like the use of big data analytics and so on. And one of the questions was actually directed to Mounu himself, which was, well, when you look at public procurement data, for example, how do you define what bad procurement looks like. So I think in this case, from my experience, what we really need is a very good understanding of the legal and normative ways in which we define corruption. So I think it would be great to hear from you. Well, not only how you define bad procurement, but also how you got to that point. Is that clear?
Yeah. So I agree with you that there is no smoking gun super clear on what happened. So I can tell from two pieces of information. So one is, if you look at just the data set of public procurement that it's kind of available in all these e-procurement websites, you usually have whether they asked for more money or whether they took more time that was needed or not. So that's one of the indicators that can help. And there is one paper by one of my co-authors that has some investigations that they did on some contracts, and then they use machine learning to see what predicts that these investigations show some type of corruption. And what they show is that usually over-invoicing or asking for more time is correlated or can predict that these contracts are likely to be corrupt. And the second one, which is more interesting as well, is just go to audits itself, with like the one I just mentioned in Brazil. It takes a lot of time because you need to go and read them, of course. But then there is a scope as well to do some machine learning after you have read a couple of them, and you can kind of do some supervised machine learning with those. And once you read, you can understand whether this was something that the politician was trying to get some benefit from it, or that this was just some procedural problem where basically they needed to hand some documents and they didn't do it, which is kind of in the gray line on whether this was corruption or not. But in some other cases, it's super clear that the politician just asked for some money and they got something in return. So that's, I think, something that one could do with all this text information and try to mine it and try to find ways of getting information out of it. And that this, of course, this is not a bulletproof on whether there is corruption or not, but can tell us where we should put our effort on where to try to find potential corruption. I don't think we can just take these and take them to the judges, but of course, with this information, we can go and put our efforts to try to understand what's really going on in these either mayors or in these contracts and so on.
Perfect, thank you very much. And I think in a way, this also links very well to one of the points that Alexandra raised in her intervention, which was, when we start working also with this type of methodologies, right? Being a economist or political scientist, like having a team of just like economists or political scientists or lawyers will no longer be enough. You need a multidisciplinary team to start doing this. And Alexandra, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add on how the World Bank is helping create such teams, or how you're also engaging in like the use of open data and its analysis, because I think a lot of the many issues as well is like we put all of these data out there, right? As also Adrián was saying earlier, and then like the skills to use it are actually not out there. So maybe you can speak to that as well. And we have like 5 minutes left, so please be brief because I still want to go to Zef and Lucio.
Thanks, Roberto. I'll be very brief. This goes very well to the point of actionability that we've been discussing throughout. And Alina mentioned the importance of permanent monitoring mechanisms and the role of government in setting those up. I think we've heard about the vital importance of national statistics agencies in supporting these efforts. And what you get with the combination of statistics and open data is an opportunity to apply pressure on policymakers. We've heard it's not a silver bullet, right? So statistics and open data can help apply pressure, and they can also help provide direction to policy reform, right? But in order to get that direction, you need to be able to interpret the data. So this is where the legibility, interpretability of the data, and the role of civil society and academic actors comes in really, really importantly. And governments can't, I don't believe, at least certainly not yet, and certainly not in most cases, perform those roles as well as the important role they have in making this data available. So the multidisciplinary aspect of interpreting public data is something where academics and NGOs come together really well. There's a huge amount of innovation happening out there, which is why the World Bank is applying this crowdsourcing approach to our research program. I mean, we're increasingly recruiting data science expertise within the institution, but I think in order to really have an impact, it needs to be a wide collaborative effort, which is why we've taken this approach with the research program.
Perfect, thank you very much. And Lucio, there's also a question from you for you and Laarni, which is, are you aware of any other institution that is actively developing a new methodology for measuring corruption and ranking countries?
Wow, there are many institutions that are working on that. So let me just take these occasions to add a couple of quick remarks since the time is almost over. First, I've been working on measures of corruption for many years, and I agree with most that has been said so far. I would simply add one issue. I think that open data is not enough. We should also ask for open code. We want to avoid the technocratic approach where, you know, we, public administrations, anti-corruption authority, you name it, talking about institutions, you know, drop down from above our nice indicators. For example, the Italian Anti-Corruption Authority, as in many other organizations, we work with the software R, and we can simply publish the code just as we publish the data. This is so much more important when, and I go back to the very interesting stuff that Mounu was telling us, if you use machine learning techniques, which are more of a even more of a black box than, you know, regular parametric techniques. Last, very quickly, no time for me to do what I like to do the best, which is to be a contrarian. But I really think that we should talk also about the measures that we do not have. And we do not have measures to try to assess illegal corruption. The United States is a fascinating case in this respect, but there is no time for that. I hope that, you know, maybe future conferences will also dedicate more time, not only to these measures that we've been discussing for the last 25 years in my experience, but also about the stuff that we simply are not even trying to measure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Zef, any final reflections from your side before we have to cut this short?
I'm talking on behalf of Western Balkans. So in this regard, Albania, North Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia have a lot of things in common, a lot of similarities on the problems related to corruption, like autocratic behavior of premiers, weak division of power of branches of the state, increasing oligarchic influences, and deterioration of democratic values. As a result, business climate, especially last 5 years, have been worsened, and EU originated companies have been mostly replaced by Chinese, Turkish, and Arab, even Russian businesses. So in this regard, I believe that strengthening, I would like to reiterate, strengthening of capacities, improving the regulatory framework, and the special enforcement of sectoral regulatory entities could help. In the same time, EU flag needs to be better used in the sense of increasing conditionalities for countries that are in the process of EU accession and closer monitoring of them. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I think there is not really that much for me to add. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying on time for your very interesting presentations. I think there's a lot to take from this discussion. I think one of the points that we have seen is that there are like we can really do a lot to advance the fight against corruption if we use the new data that is coming up, like all of these technologies that are emerging. There's a lot that we can do there, but there is also a lot that we can do with less advanced techniques if we use them well, and if we look, just beyond the national level. I think that's another big frontier that we have, right? We still sometimes conceptualize corruption as like, within the national borders. And I think we saw many examples here as well today that show that this is not necessarily the case, that there are like differences between like within the national borders. So I hope this was useful and interesting for all of the over 500 participants. So I guess on that note, I thank you, everyone. Again, I thank the organizers, the great translators, and I guess that's that. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thanks,
And we
Roberto.
will continue this.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists and moderator for this important and interesting session. Sin duda, esta sesión nos ayuda a generar ideas en preparación a las actividades del grupo de trabajo.
Undoubtedly, this session is going to be a great supporting information for the OECD in order to design a new framework. This group is going to start